There will be fewer and fewer jobs that a robot cannot do better.
Okay.
What to do about mass unemployment? This is going to be a massive social challenge. And I think ultimately we will have to have some kind of universal basic income. I don't think we're going to have a choice.
Universal basic income.
Universal basic income, I think it's going to be necessary.
So it means that unemployed people will be paid across the globe.
Yeah.
Because there is no job, machine, robot is taking over.
That's simply and I want to be clear that these are not things that I think that I wish would happen. These are simply things that I think probably will happen. And if my assessment is correct and they probably will happen, then we need to say, what are we going to do about it? And I think some kind of a universal basic income is going to be necessary. Now, the output of goods and services will be extremely high. So with automation, there will come abundance. There will be almost everything will get very cheap. I think I think we'll just end up doing a universal basic income. It's going to be necessary. The harder challenge, much harder challenge, is how do people then have meaning? Like a lot of people, they derive their meaning from their employment. So if you don't have, if you're not needed, if there's not a need for your labor, what's the meaning? Do you have meaning? Do you feel useless? That's a much harder problem to deal with.
I think there's a pretty good chance we end up with a universal basic income or something like that due to automation. I'm not sure what else one would do this, but that's kind of, I think, what would happen. And people have time to do other things and more complex things, more interesting things, so they have more leisure time. And then we've got to figure out how we integrate with a world in the future with advanced AI. I do have a thought, but it would take too long to convey in this interview. But ultimately, I think there would need to be some kind of improved symbiosis with digital superintelligence.
Yeah, so I've been driven to universal basic income in part because I've been looking at the numbers. The 5 most common jobs in the United States right now are administrative and clerical work, retail and sales, food service and food prep, truck driving and transportation and manufacturing. Those 5 jobs comprise about half of all American jobs. Only 32% of Americans graduate from college. So the average American is a high school grad doing one of these 5 jobs. And if you look at it, technology is already doing a number on each of these jobs. Like the first, administrative and clerical, includes call center workers, and AI is in the process of taking over that job. Retail and sales, 30% of malls are closing in the next 4 years. So the danger here is to think of it as artificial intelligence is coming. It's actually already eating up the most common jobs in our economy, and it's driving Americans into distress in various ways in the numbers.
Are there other alternatives that you've considered other than just universal basic income, like educating people about this being a real issue and perhaps pushing them or directing them towards other occupations?
The truth of it, Joe, is that there are 3.5 million truck drivers in this country right now. It's the most common job in 29 states. And the average trucker is a 49-year-old guy with a high school education, maybe ex-military. So then if you say, hey, I'm going to retrain 500,000 truck drivers, for what exactly is like issue number one?
Right.
And that these guys didn't love school 30 years ago. It's not like driving a truck has made them really excited about the idea.
Yeah.
And then the new job you're training them for, I looked into the data as to how good we were at retraining, let's say, displaced manufacturing workers in the Midwest when we started decimating their jobs. And we're terrible at it. Like, according to independent studies, government-funded retraining programs had a success rate of between 0 and 15% in real life. Like, this is what actually happened to the workers of Michigan and Indiana and Ohio.
I mean, I'm trying to look at this through rose-colored glasses, I guess. I'm trying to think if there's a way that these people can adapt.
People legitimately talk about retraining coal miners to be software engineers. Stuff that on the face of it makes no sense. But the reason why we're stretching for that is because we're looking for some kind of retraining-oriented solution when the numbers show that that's just not going to be the recipe, therefore actual success.
It's kind of preposterous to ask someone who doesn't have an education to do something that's as difficult as code, computer language.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we're going to get to a point where AI can do some basic coding at a certain level.
When you're talking about universal basic income, there's 2 questions that come up. How much money and where is it coming from?
So first, I want to say that if you look at the heritage of universal basic income, it's a deeply American idea where Thomas Paine was for it at the founding of the country. And then Martin Luther King was for it. Milton Friedman, the godfather of conservative economists, was for it. And one state has had it in effect for 37 years, where everyone in that state gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked.
This is Alaska?
Yeah, it's Alaska, and they fund it with oil money. And what I'm going around telling people is that technology is the oil of the 21st century. We're spending about $1.5 trillion right now on 126 welfare programs and Social Security. So the $3 trillion actually shrinks a lot very fast because of the fact that about half of Americans are already getting various income support from the government. So the real price tag is closer to about 1.8 trillion if you say everyone who's 18 and up. Now, for context, the entire U.S. economy is now 20 trillion, up 5 trillion in the last 12 years, and the federal budget's 4 trillion. So you're looking at 1.8 trillion. It's a lot of money. We all know that right now most Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. 57% of Americans can't afford an unexpected $500 bill. So you put $1,000 a month into their hands, it's going to go right back into the economy. They're going to spend it on food, childcare, car repairs they've been putting off, the occasional night out. And then all of those businesses end up hiring more people, and then we end up getting some of the money back as tax revenues. We're going to get back, let's call it $400 billion in new tax receipts because everyone's going to be spending more money. We're going to save $100 to $200 billion on things like incarceration and homelessness services and emergency room healthcare. It's a great incentive to try and stay out of jail because, you stop getting it if you wind up in jail.
How much crime do you think you could actually prevent, though, by giving people $1,000 a month? I mean, I think most of the people that are doing crime, whether it's thievery or assault, they're not thinking this out. This is just either a way of life for them, either, they've got real mental issues or a pattern of behavior that they can't break. I really don't think that $1,000 a month is going to fix any of that.
Well, it's not going to fix all of it, for sure. I mean, we'll still have jails. It's not like, silver bullet.
Yeah.
But at the margins, would it keep like that person who's falling through the cracks and feels like they have no place in society? And maybe they, it's like the people around them are also like, hey, you don't have any value, and you get $1,000 a month. Maybe like it keeps them off at the margins. And everything we're talking about is at the margins. I mean, everything's like this statistical curve, and you're taking the people who are, let's call it like the last 10 to 20%. But if you reduce our incarcerated population by 10 to 20%, I mean, that's billions and billions of dollars.
How many people have no idea that this is coming?
Well, what I say to people, Joe, is I say, hey, have you noticed stores closing on your main street? And then they say yes. And then I ask them, why is that? And then they reflect for a minute, and then they say, Amazon. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. I'm like the only person just laying out the facts and being like, guys, it's not your imagination. Like, we actually are getting rid of the most common jobs in the U.S. economy, filled by high school graduates, and then replacing them with a handful of jobs for higher skilled people in different places. And then we're pretending that the first population is somehow going to access the new opportunities, when the odds of them getting up and like moving to Seattle or whatnot and becoming a web designer or like logistics manager or big data scientist or something, like essentially near zero.
Well, I love the idea, and it would be amazing if you won. I mean, it really would be fascinating. And like I said, I've done a complete 180 on the idea of universal basic income.
We're going to go through a revolution. You'd rather undertake it than undergo it. It's like if the revolution's coming, then we need to get in front of it and start making it work for us instead of just waiting for it to tear us apart.
See, there's a couple of things about that one that concerns me because, so we're having a conversation here where we're taking differences in IQ seriously. But the problem with the guaranteed annual income issue, I think one of the problems, and I'm not denying its potential utility, it's something I think that would have to be experimentally determined, and all of that. And maybe it could replace a plethora of less efficient social welfare programs. But, it isn't obvious to me. It's obvious to me that there's a substantial proportion of the population, and I would say it's probably 5%, that would destroy themselves instantly if you gave them a guaranteed annual income. And they would do it because they're very low in conscientiousness, for example, and very impulsive. And like I've worked with many guys, often ex-cocaine addicts, who were often not all that high on the end of the cognitive distribution, but very, very low in conscientiousness, high in impulsivity. And those guys were absolutely fine as long as they were flat broke. But man, I tell you, as soon as they had money, they were done. It was like 3 days in the bar, cocaine binge, face down in a ditch, and then they were fine until they got money again. And so the problem with the guaranteed annual income solution is that, man does not live by bread alone, let's say. And if you have money and you have things to do, then you have a life. But if you just have money, you don't have a life.
So a 2020 candidate named Andrew Yang has brought up a topic that's big now of universal basic income. And before you destroy it with facts and logic, my question about it is everybody from Martin Luther King Jr. to Milton Friedman has advocated for some form of guaranteed income. And I think you can agree that usually when the government runs things, that maybe they don't end up very good. So if more money was focused on going into the hands of people without restriction, would you be in favor of some form of universal basic income?
So there is a distinction between different types of universal basic income. Sometimes by universal basic income, people just mean that the government is going to sign a check in addition to the current means-tested welfare programs that exist. Sometimes they mean, like Milton Friedman meant, a negative income tax, meaning we get rid of all of the welfare system, and instead we just sign you a flat check. Right? And that flat check basically is going to be for whatever you want it to be for. I think that the record of universal basic income has not been particularly successful. They tried it in Ontario. They had to stop it because it was incentivizing people not to work. They tried it in Norway. It was also not particularly effective. They had to stop it because it was incentivizing people to be unwilling to work. It's an idea that makes sense only under the supposition that there is a group of legitimate unemployables. And that seems to be the growing perception these days, is that technology is going to take over. There's going to be a permanent underclass of people who simply can't get a job. They're going to be sitting on their butt. They won't literally have a means to live unless we sign them a check. I'm pretty skeptical of that line of economic thought, because that's been said about virtually every major technological development in the history of mankind, is that a new technological development will put an enormous swath of people out of work. That is true temporarily. It is not true permanently. We have effectively permanent full employment in the United States, under 4%. So the notion, and we have 7 million unfilled jobs right now, and people who are not filling them. So I don't really want to incentivize people to not go and get those jobs. If we ever reach the point where there is universal prosperity, to the point where there is no scarcity problem, where it's not a matter of redistributing finite resources, but a matter of resources are plentiful for everyone, then I think that or we reach a point where there is a permanent group of unemployables, as we say, then I think that we'll have no choice but to look at something like universal basic income. I just don't think we're there yet.
There's got to be some way where you can give these people the opportunity to step out of that pattern. Whatever that,
For sure.
Community centers, outreach programs, whatever it is. I don't know what it is.
I mean, the truth is that historically speaking, it was people actually going to church.
Yes.
I mean, and there's
lot of good. I'm not a church-going person,
right,
but I absolutely recognize that there's a lot of good involved in having that framework.
Right, and that I'm not sure that's. I don't think you can create sort of a fake social fabric with just a government welfare system. Like it hasn't
Right.
worked. I mean, disability exists. It's been increasing every year. It's not. It's a question I asked Andrew Yang, actually. So our episode comes out on Sunday, and obviously Andrew is a big fan of UBI, Universal Basic Income. And I'm not averse to the idea of UBI in a future where legitimately 50% of the population can't work because they've all been automated out of existence and all of this. But there's one section in his book where Andrew talks about how if we cut people a check for UBI, then they will spend their extra time creating art and engaging in hobbies that they like. And I just thought to myself, I said it to him, like, people are on disability. That ain't what they're doing. Right? I mean, if you're on disability, the people you're talking about who are suffering, they're not out there writing poetry. Right? I mean, the rise of the opioid epidemic and people who are ODing on drugs and all this stuff, that's in precisely the same demographic you're talking about. You're just talking about a check from one place as opposed to another place. I don't really see how that solves the problem. I think we have a crisis of purpose right now, and I don't think that crisis of purpose is solvable on the one hand by changing our trade rules, and I also don't think that crisis of purpose is solvable by cutting a government check. I just don't think that that's how people are wired.
I absolutely agree with you that there is a crisis of purpose. My concern is about automation, and my concern, and obviously I haven't really studied this other than talking to Andrew Yang and talking to Elon Musk and a few other people that are proponents of universal basic income. They think that there's going to be such a massive loss of jobs in such a short period of time from people that are non-skilled laborers, and it's going to go away. There's millions and millions of jobs, and these people are not going to have anything, and then it could be chaos.
Right. So there's two problems that come up there, and this is where Andrew's book is interesting, because problem number one is that the people will be poor. They won't have a source of income.
Yes.
UBI solves that. The other problem...
Sort of, but does it even? It gives them $1,000 a month.
Even if you opted, right? I mean, even if you just had a Swedish redistribution system and the average tax rate went up to 60% or something, it might, let's say we could solve the money problem for a second, which, without tanking the economy, which is questionable. But let's say we could do that. We could add trillions of dollars to the budget every year, and we could solve that. I'm still not sure that solves the deeper problem, which is that when people lose jobs, they lose purpose.
Yes.
Right. So I'm not sure that UBI solves that problem.
It doesn't.
As I say, we have a rich social welfare network in the United States, and we're seeing this stuff happen anyway. I'm a little bit less catastrophic. By a little bit, I mean a fair bit less catastrophic in my thinking about automation than either Andrew Yang or Elon Musk.
Do you think that people will be able to adapt quick enough to avoid the problems? They'll realize the jobs aren't there anymore, and they'll just naturally gravitate towards other professions?
I think over time that people will do that, but they're not always the same people. I mean, there's always shift in the economy, and the ideal economic model has a trucker becoming a coder, right? But that's not reality.
Well, that was that whole learn to code fiasco
Right.
that got people kicked off of Twitter.
Right. And it
Still
as soon
does,
as it was-
apparently.
Yeah, apparently if you say it to journalists, then that's very bad. If you say
That's
learn to
what
code
it
to a
is?
trucker, yeah, that's what it was. That's
You
what
say
it was.
learn to code to a trucker?
If you say learn to code to a trucker, then that's just you being helpful.
Right.
If you say learn to code to a journalist, then that is targeted harassment on Twitter. That's where
What if
that
someone
started.
says it to me?
Well,
How does
I
that
mean,
work?
Twitter doesn't care about you. I can say whatever I want to you on Twitter. But it's, but yeah, I mean, I think that
But if you just say it to a
It's-
friend, hey, fuckface, learn to code.
I don't know. Is your
What
friend going to
happens?
report you to the
You get taken
censorship
out.
board over at Twitter?
It's such a dumb thing to take people out for. It's one of the best examples of like how censorship oversteps its boundaries and becomes almost like satire.
Yeah, it's really
The
really
idea
absurd.
that like this is the biggest aggression ever, learn to code.
Learn to code.
Like
And-
that's something. Look, this is a stupid thing that someone said about coal miners. They
Right.
literally said that about coal miners, that maybe they can learn to code. And so everybody's like, what the fuck? And so learn to code became a joke and became something that you would mock people.
Right.
Their explanation for it was so crazy. It was like, no, then learn to code got connected with
white
all this white
supremacists
supremacy and all this
4chan.
other stuff.
Well,
Like,
that's the Hitler owned a dog
Yes,
argument, right?
exactly.
It's like dogs are bad. Hitler owned one. Okay, white
Yes.
supremacists are bad. They use the phrase "learn to code." That means if you say "learn to code," you're a white supremacist. Like what the?
That's how they lost the frog, that fucking frog, the feels good man frog. That's what happened to Pepe. They lost him.
They
He
killed the
became-
frog. They turned the freaking frog gay. I mean, what?
Yeah, it
But-
is. Oh, that's yeah. It
But
is-
yeah, I mean, as far as automation, there's constantly people saying this is the Nicholas Nassim Taleb view of reality, which that the black swan incident can happen any second, so watch out for it. Versus the sort of Steven Pinker view of reality, which is the black swan incident is called a black swan incident because it's a black swan incident, meaning that it happens incredibly rarely. The idea that we are on the verge of a catastrophic drop in job numbers because of the automation of trucking, for example, I'm not sure that I buy it. The reason I don't buy it is because you still are going to need someone sitting behind the wheel of that truck. There are human drivers on the road. There will be a gradual transition away from some of these jobs. Andrew Yang talks about radiologists and how radiologists are going to be priced out of the market by computers. They can do a better job of diagnosing tumors. First of all, awesome, right? I mean, that's good. First of all, that brings down cost and you won't get cancer as advanced. So that'd be a good thing. But second of all, what a lot of technology studies have tended to show is that technology just gets integrated in a different way in particular careers. So there will be jobs that are eliminated for sure. There will be jobs we haven't heard of that will be created also. And mostly technology will become more of a productivity aid to people. So this is true in factories. Jobs have been lost in factories. It's the best example of where jobs are lost, but it's mostly true in offices, right? How many office jobs have been created because you have computers? Would more office jobs exist because I write by hand?
Do you think that this is akin to like a government bailout? Like the idea of the government bailout was like the banks are too big to fail. And some people thought, you know what, you got to let them fail so you figure out why they failed and we'll never have it happen again. If there is this thing and the government steps in and says, wait a minute, I know you lost all your jobs. We're going to give you $1,000. You don't have to figure it out. $1,000 a month. And some people go, okay, I'm not going to figure it out now. Whereas those people might have gone on a fear-filled journey to try to figure out their purpose in life because now they're stuck where their job doesn't exist anymore, so they're put in a corner and they have to act.
There is enervation that comes from a welfare check. I mean, there are people who become dependent on government, and they're used to being dependent on government. I mean, that stuff is true.
It does happen.
I mean, and listen, Milton Friedman made an argument for universal basic income as a replacement for the welfare system. There is another problem with universal basic income that I asked Andrew about also, and that was, one of the big issues is that poor people, very often, people who are permanently impoverished, not people who are temporarily poor, but they tend not to spend money where we think they ought to spend money. Right? They're not taking that money and they're not putting it into education or into.
They might just be buying ho-hos and cigarettes.
Right. I mean, the average person who is making less than, I think it was $16,000 a year, spending $400 a year on lottery tickets. Right. I mean, that's legitimately just flushing your money down the toilet. Yeah. So how do you? Aren't you just going to end up back in the same place? In 6 months, where people took that money and used it in ways that actually didn't benefit them? And at a certain point, the question is, do you own your decisions or do you not own your decisions? And at what level of incompetence or inability do we say you no longer own your decisions and so we're just going to take care of you on a permanent basis? That's really the the question here.
I think we're looking at, when you're talking about welfare, we're looking at worst case scenario, right? Where someone does get dependent upon the welfare state and does use that money frivolously and does make poor decisions. But then there's got to be other people that are single moms that, maybe had a kid with some fucking asshole that doesn't want to pay and is a piece of shit and they have to hide from them and they're just trying to feed their kids.
Yeah, for sure.
Those people exist too.
100%.
And they don't have a community to help them out. Maybe they're not a part of a church. Maybe they don't have a good group of neighbors. Maybe they had to move somewhere for work and they got stuck in some place where they don't know anybody.
Sure. But I think part of this is to recognize that incentives matter on both ends. So the idea is that you give some people more money and they'll do well. It's also true that if you create a welfare system that benefits single motherhood, you will get more single motherhood. I mean, the single motherhood rate in the black community before welfare was 20%. Now it's 70%.